This is a Dauntless Media Collective podcast. Visit dauntless.fm for more content.
I had a friend who was part of this group, and she sent me in the mail a tract, like a Christian tract, with her Christmas card that year. And I called her and I said, I'm so hurt by this. Like, why would you send this to me? I'm applying to rabbinical school. Like, you know how committed I am to this thing that I'm doing. She said, I love your Judaism. I just want you to complete it. This is what Jews for Jesus is about, to specifically evangelize to Jews. It's like hard. It's a little hard for me to wrap my mind around as a Jew, because this is not a thing that Jews do. As soon as that happens, you know that's not Judaism.
Hi, I'm Nate.
I'm Gail.
And this is Full Mutuality. So today we are joined by a social media friend of mine who I've had the privilege of having a couple conversations in person with. Her name is Ariann Weitzman. She is the rabbi educator at B'nai Keshet in Montclair, New Jersey. And Rabbi Ariann, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really excited about this conversation.
You're so welcome. I'm really glad to join you.
So I guess to start things off, if you could share with us a little bit about your background, where you're from, where maybe a little bit about your origin story and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I have been Jewish my whole life, unlike perhaps some of your guests, most of your guests. I'm not walking away from the church. I've never belonged to one. And I grew up in the conservative Judaism movement of Judaism called conservative Judaism. Said that a little funny. I grew up in conservative Judaism and was part of that movement of Judaism until I was an adult. And was raised in a fairly observant home with a lot of engagement in our local synagogue. We belong to various synagogue communities. I started out life in San Diego, lived there for a long time, and then New Jersey, suburban New Jersey. And when I was in college, I discovered the Reconstructionist movement, which is where I serve now. Reconstructionism is a break off of the conservative movement, roughly 100 years old, a little bit younger than that. And Reconstructionism differs in a variety of ways from conservative Judaism, but I'll just touch on a couple of those ways. So first, Reconstructionism values egalitarian democratic participation. So we often make decisions as a community in a democratic way, led with guidance by the rabbi, teaching by the rabbi, but the rabbi does not necessarily have the final say, especially in terms of ritual life, right? We want to take a full gamut of opinions into consideration and really weigh the full values of the community. We call that values-based decision-making. Another way that we differ from the conservative movement is that we are rather non-hierarchical. We're egalitarian in many, many ways. So one of the early ways that looked like was making sure that women had full participation in the synagogue, which eventually the conservative movement caught up. Basically, all liberal Judaism is on the same page on those issues now, but that extended to making sure we had full inclusion of LGBTQI participation of our community and other forms of egalitarianism. We reject the idea of chosenness, and when Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionism, first set out that proposition, that was a much more radical thing to say. Now it is a little bit less radical. Most liberal movements are very gentle in the way that they approach the idea of Jewish chosenness, the idea that Jews are chosen by God for a particular mission, and don't say that in such a strong way anymore. But Mordecai Kaplan really felt in the 30s, in the 1930s, he was saying, this is elitist, this is chauvinistic, this is a problem, right? We shouldn't be saying these kinds of things. We are interested in democracy. We're interested in the egalitarian, we're interested in the equality of all people, and that includes non-Jews. And even though I wouldn't say that most Jews who hold a position that Jews are the chosen people are particularly chauvinistic about it, it is a way of distancing ourselves from other peoples, right? Another thing that is really interesting about Reconstructionism, and is now really shared by a lot of Jewish movements, but was an idea that Kaplan really pushed forward, was thinking about Judaism as a culture, as a civilization, as a people, and not just a religion, and not just a faith, but a people who have a religion, right? So there's many different ways into Jewish practice that don't look religious. And that's really something that's been true throughout Jewish history, but Kaplan put a name to that. And we often, I think, across the Jewish spectrum now talk about Judaism as an ethno-religion, right? A religion that is about a people and peoplehood, and all of the things that it means to be a people, right? But he really put language to that, and Reconstructionist Jews really lean into that idea. You'll also just generally find that Reconstructionist communities tend to be progressive, which makes sense given everything else that I said.
Right.
But they look really different in terms of ritual life, because the movement is not that old, and because every community makes a lot of its own decisions about ritual life. There's a diversity of our practice. So some of our practice looks a little bit more conservative or a little bit more traditional. Some of our practice looks a little bit more, a little different than traditional in a variety of ways. And so there's a nice spectrum there.
I see.
And I have been a rabbi for 12 years and serving B'nai Keshet the whole time.
At what point did you know you wanted to become a rabbi? And were you always passionate about going in this direction, or was it something that grew on you, or how did that come about?
I was always passionate about Judaism. I always felt at home in the synagogue and safe in synagogues in a way that I didn't necessarily feel in other places in my life. But I had sort of two moments. When I was 12, I have a very distinct memory of looking up at my rabbi on the bima and thinking, I could do that. Do that. That didn't really go anywhere because I didn't know how one became a rabbi. And I went to school. I studied astronomy as an undergrad. And I had an awakening my junior year, and I realized, or maybe the summer after my junior year, realized this was really not for me. I wasn't going to apply to grad school. I wasn't going to become a scientist. That's not how that was going to work out. I still love science very much, still keep up, but that's not where I was going in life. And I remembered that moment. I went to my Hillel rabbi on campus and I said, how does somebody become a rabbi? Like, how does that work? And he was so lovely about it. We started studying together every week. We had an hour-long study session every Friday afternoon through my senior year. And that was that. Then I started thinking about how to apply to rabbinical school.
I'm curious about something. As you were talking, something that stood out to me. And I think for the purposes of this conversation, and given our background and our relationship to Judaism, I think having grown up in evangelical Christianity, both Gail, myself, and many of our audience members probably have a whole lot of misconceptions or misunderstandings about Judaism. And those misconceptions are often founded in this a little bit of an arrogant, at least in the environments that I grew up in, this sort of arrogant, like, we know better, and the stuff that we know is the truth. And unfortunately, that then finds its way into how we interact with faiths that are different from ours. And because a sort of traditional bastardization of your texts are found within our texts, we tend to become very arrogant about how we approach Judaism. But there was a question that popped up in my mind as you were describing, particularly Reconstructionist Judaism, but Judaism in general, that there's a branch, or correct me, my language, forgive my language here, or vocabulary, but you were mentioning conservative Judaism includes Reconstructionist Judaism and other forms and sects as well. Could you help kind of clarify some of that language? Because in contrast to Christianity, there isn't this distinction between conservative Christianity and, let's say, liberal Christianity. There is a hard break, whereas in Judaism, that's not the case.
Yeah, so I'm gonna correct a couple of things. So first, Reconstructionism is not part of conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism is a movement in and of itself. The Reconstructionist movement, which is now called Reconstructing Judaism, is a movement in and of itself that had its birth in the conservative movement among leaders of the conservative movement, but it didn't live there for very long.
I see.
And now it is its own movement. Broadly speaking, people often talk about 4, sometimes 5 movements of Judaism: Orthodoxy, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Reform, Renewal. That order doesn't mean anything. That's not the chronological order in which they developed or anything. It's just a list. And when we talk about liberal Judaism, we are usually meaning everything that's not Orthodoxy.
I see.
And conservative Judaism, with a big C, is the name of the movement because when the movement developed, they were trying to conserve historical practices. They were trying to conserve tradition, not because they were anti-modern or anti-liberal. On the contrary, it was, in fact, a very liberal movement in many, many ways, and continues to be. But it is a more conserving of traditional practice movement than the rest of liberal Judaism tends to be. That was their guiding force. And the conservative movement developed in many ways as a response to both the Reform movement, which is much less conserving of tradition on purpose, right? They were attempting to reform, and it's not Reformed Judaism, ED, it's Reform, no ED. There is no Reformed Judaism. Reform Judaism was very much making a break with some traditional practices in its inception on purpose. They were making various both theological and sociological statements in their development. So the conservative was like, we're not doing that. That's not our goal. But also, we are not trying to recreate Orthodox practice, which doesn't quite serve us in this moment in a variety of ways. And we're also trying to figure out, the conservative movement was really an American movement. We're trying to figure out how to serve Jews in the United States. Mostly the waves and waves and waves, literally millions of Jews who were coming in from Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century, who were traditional Jews. They had traditional practice for the most part, but wouldn't necessarily identify as Orthodox. So it was serving a particular place and time, and not Reform and not Orthodox, and so it became conservative. It is a slightly confusing term for that reason, but the conservative movement is in fact part of liberal Judaism.
That's so helpful for you to break that down. I would have had the same misconception, so I appreciate you unpacking that.
Right. And I also would go a little bit further and say that while there are very much conservative small c elements in Judaism, there are more right-leaning and more left-leaning elements in Judaism, there's less of a hard break because Jews really understand other Jews to be part of our family. And most Jewish families contain people who are in all of these places and who are trying to accommodate each other. And there's a lot of cross-pollination, right? So we are, for sure, we are being moved by our own ideologies, which lead us to have some different practices. But we very much understand ourselves, most Jews very much understand ourselves to be one people, and to have to sort of figure out how to talk to each other. And as a Jewish professional, I'm constantly in contact, in relationship with other Jewish professionals across movements, trying to figure things out together, trying to learn together. And for the most part, those relationships are very civil and respectful and positive.
I find that so fascinating because within our large family of Christendom, Christianity at large, we often hear language like, oh, they're not a real Christian, or that group is doing something, their beliefs don't line up with X, Y, and Z, therefore they must not be true Christians. They have a woman pastor. That's not a true Christian group. So there's always these delineations that tend to pop up in Christian organizations and churches and denominations. They tend to draw these lines as far as, who's a real Christian and who's not a real Christian. And what I often found is even coming out of evangelicalism, where having grown up in fundamentalist and evangelical places where we drew these lines and said, oh, they don't believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ, therefore they're not true Christians. And coming out of that space and now entering a space where I'm a part of a church where we would kind of hold the idea of physical resurrection, maybe not, but that's not important to the task that we're doing as a church. And I know that Rabbi Ariann, you're very familiar with our church.
Very familiar.
But it's fascinating though, because in some of the circles of people who are post-evangelical but maintaining some relationship to Christianity, we find ourselves doing similar things. Like we'll say, oh, those people are not very loving, they're not very welcoming, and that's not the message that Jesus would have taught, and therefore they're not real Christian. And we do the same sort of gatekeeping, and we fall into the no true Scotsman fallacy so often. So I find that really fascinating that amongst Jews, there is this mentality of, despite all our differences and approaches to how we interact with the world around us, how we interact with society, how we interact with non-Jews, we still recognize each other as part of this, one family. So yeah, that's very fascinating to me.
Yeah, I would say it's a difference of perspective. So, what you're describing is these folks have a different ideological stance than I do, so they're not Christians, right? Whereas we might say, these folks have a different ideological stance than we do. They are Jews, so we have to go argue with them. So, right? They're part of us, and it matters. It matters what they do. It affects us. And I wouldn't say it doesn't exist in Judaism that people say those people aren't Jewish. I mean, you'll mostly see it from Orthodox groups noticing liberal Jews, observing or not observing particular mitzvot, particular commandments, and understanding that to be problematic. There's also one very big argument that lives inside Judaism, having to do with the way Judaism is passed down from parents to children. So for many, many hundreds of years, the understanding was if your mother was Jewish, if your birth mother was Jewish, then you were Jewish. And if your birth father wasn't Jewish or was Jewish, it didn't matter. Really, the mother is who mattered. And over the last couple of decades, or now it's probably 4 decades, maybe 5. I mean, it's been a long time now. I lose track of time. The Reform movement and Reconstructing Judaism both accept what we call patrilineal descent, which means if your father was Jewish, but not your mother, and you were raised as a Jew, that's an important second step, and you were raised as a Jew, then you are Jewish. And in my movement, we say if you have either parent is Jewish and you were raised as a Jew, then you're Jewish. So we might not assume that someone with a Jewish mother is Jewish, right? Because if they have a Jewish mother and a Catholic father and they were raised as a Catholic, they're not Jewish. We affirm that they're Catholic, right? Whereas Orthodoxy would say they're Jewish because their mother's Jewish, right? So there is a division around those issues and personal identity status, which are very, very important and very fractious. So that's like a big thing where we do have this, this fragmenting of community, and we have to kind of work on that. But I would say in general, when we have ideological differences like the ones you describe, Jews don't really understand who's another Jew by what opinions they hold, by what beliefs they hold, right? That's not usually how we divide ourselves. You'll see a lot of commonality in terms of belief across movements. But you'll see difference in practice, and we'll notice each other's practice and how that's different. And that's where we might have arguments.
Your comment about how when you have other Jews who differ from you, the response is, so now we got to argue about it. I loved that. It made me smile because so coming out of evangelicalism, I mean, I wanted to start learning about Judaism through Jewish people rather than what I had heard through Christianity, and evangelical Christianity even more so limiting on the perspective. So I joined a Facebook group and it was called Ask a Jew Anything or something like that. I'm not remembering the exact title, but in the rules when you sign up, it says straight up, right away, one of the things it says is the first thing you need to know is that Jews don't agree on anything, pretty much. And it was like, you need to understand going in that part of Judaism is this dialogue, this continuous disagreeing and arguing and debating stuff. Like, Nate was describing the whole, okay, do we have the same ideological differences in Christianity? No, you're not a real Christian is the attitude. Whereas to me, that was just such a different frame. It was like, if you're going to ask a Jew something, be prepared that a lot of Jews are going to have different opinions, and they're all Jews. So that to me was something unique, different, beautiful that I was looking at. And I had heard another rabbi say, like, the one thing all Jews agree on is pretty much the Messianic Judaism is not Jewish.
That's correct. We agree on that.
And I was like, that's the one thing that they were all going to agree on. And that is fascinating, I guess. And maybe we can touch on this a bit later.
The one.
Yeah.
That was the one thing that it said they all agreed on. And for me, that was the only perspective that I really got to hear Jewish input on was from people who are not considered Jewish by Jewish people, which is so sad when I think about it, that was the movement where I was like, now you're going to get a Jewish opinion. Here we go. Messianic Jew, here's a microphone. And to know that the Jewish community, that's probably one of the only areas where they're like, actually, this is where we all have the same view.
Before we go into that, because I do want to land there and I want to spend a good chunk of time there, but I want to bring up other like common misconceptions about Judaism that often come from the Christian world, but maybe the larger non-Jewish world as well. And then really kind of take a deeper dive into this Messianic Jewish thing. But there are 4 common misconceptions, and I'm wondering if maybe like for each one, if you could just address a little bit about it. So here's
only 4. Wow. Okay.
Well, sorry, I say 4. There are certainly dozens and probably hundreds more, but these are like 4 that I found on this website, and I'll if I think of it, I'll throw a link in the show notes. But the first one, and this is very much a Christian misunderstanding, is that we can understand Judaism by reading the Old Testament.
Fantastic. Okay, so I want to say a couple things first about just the language. So Jews don't have an Old Testament.
Yes.
So the language of Old Testament, New Testament is entirely Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And what comprises the Old Testament is not identical to Jewish scriptures, which we call Tanakh, which is an acronym. It stands for Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, the books of the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings, which is sort of like everything else, like Psalms and Proverbs and Ezra and Chronicles, those things. And the reason why that's really important is we don't understand the Bible as having like an arc, a narrative arc getting us someplace else, right? So Old Testament works if your goal is to get to the New Testament, right? It's old. It's the one that is passé. It is the covenant that is no longer. Testament in the context of Bible, when we talk about Bible, means covenant, right? This agreement. And so that one is old. The one with the Jews is old. That's over. And the ordering of the books of the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, lead us to Jesus, right? Like that's the narrative arc of the Old Testament. On the other hand, Tanakh is like, it's not random. It's basically a chronological ordering of the books as they were written. But it is a little bit random. It is very multivocal, and it's hard to read it as anything but that. It has no arc. It is sort of all over the place in terms of genre and theme. And it's not trying to do anything else, right? It is telling a very long story in many, many parts across space and time about the relationship of a people, of a nation with their God and with their history. Some of that history is mythic history, right? Not factual history, but mythic history, right? So they're talking about, this is our national mythos. That's what Tanakh is, right? And it is our sacred core, right? So everything that comes from Judaism, in the end, we often are trying to point back to Tanakh, and we also start there. We read Torah every single week in synagogue. We use a lot of these texts in liturgy, right? We're pointing back to Tanakh a lot as sort of like a sacred core that joins all Jewish people. but most Jewish practice will not be found anywhere in those books. Right? So a lot of Jewish stories will be found there, right? Very essential stories. I mean, we tell the story of the Exodus constantly, multiple times a day, multiple times a year in particular holidays, right? Like those stories are really, really central. But the practices are not, right? So Jews like to say that there are 613 mitzvot, that means commandments, in Torah. More than half of them cannot be done today because they have to do with the sacrificial system in the ancient temple, or other kinds of practices having to do with the land of Israel that are no longer happening. And so that doesn't leave a lot of things, right? And then the way that we practice actually is an evolved system of rituals and practices and daily life that have evolved over the last 2,000 years. And the core of those practices, if you want to learn more about those practices, you should not look at Tanakh. You should look at Mishnah and Talmud, which are among our earliest rabbinic documents that are basically just conversations among the rabbis about what Jewish practice is supposed to look like and what their own personal Jewish practice looked like. So it includes a lot of like sort of the rules of daily living, but also a lot of these conversations that go around it, conversations about values, stories about values, arguments, right? Even the value of arguing is found there and really enshrined in those texts. And that's the place where you find the root of rabbinic Judaism, which is the Judaism that is practiced by 99% or more of Jews today. There are some other smaller groups of Jews, Karaite Jews, for example, who don't follow Talmud and who have some slightly different practices. But for the most part, if you meet a Jew, they are practicing rabbinic Judaism, which has its root in that Second Temple period, and then in those rabbinic documents, the Mishnah and the Talmud. Even though we are rooted in Tanakh. But if you read Torah, you will know very, very little about how Jews practice Judaism. Not because this is not part of our history, but it describes our ancient Israelite past. And we are not nomadic herders, wandering through the wilderness, worshiping in the tabernacle, right? That doesn't exist.
Right.
And we have changed like everybody else. So, I would be alarmed if we hadn't changed. And in fact, the reason why we're still around is because things look different now, right? We are adaptable.
It's another thing that I find really meaningful coming out of my own tradition, because in evangelical tradition, Christian tradition, which is prominent in the US, especially in terms of Christianity, but like this idea of like, there's almost an unawareness of its history and its roots. It's sort of like we're trying to go back to be the original Christians, but there's not a recognition of the diversity over time and the evolution and the change and the reality that it's not easy to go back even to early Christianity and to put yourself there because there's so much context you don't know. But I feel like part of my movement was like almost a pushback against the concept of evolution on the scientific front, but then even personal change and growth, it was so much more about we have the truth and less about let's look at how we as a group have continuously changed our opinion and mind on different things and how we've grown and evolved, and that adaptability is important. So that value is something that I feel like has been missing from my own experience. I don't know.
I mean, thank God for religious evolution. I mean, none of our communities would exist, right?
Right. Oh, yeah.
And what's ironic is evangelical Christians on the Christian tree are the newcomers, but they have very little understanding of that concept of like, you wouldn't be around if that change thing wasn't, an important factor in all of it, right? Yeah. Like, because you're like such a new branch of all of it.
Well, this is common among fundamentalist thinking.
Yeah.
Not saying that all evangelicals would consider themselves fundamentalists, but like this kind of thinking of there are fundamentals to which we need to go back to and like kind of rebuild. And then we'll be doing the right thing if we just get the fundamentals right and we really dig deep into those. And this like fallacy of the past was better. Like we knew how to do it. If we can just reimagine what that was like and we'll just do it like that, it'll be great. And there's a reason we're not in the past anymore. And, it's an incredible thing that human beings are so good at taking our stories and bringing them forward into the future and figuring out new applications for them and learning how to do this religion thing in a new way. It's really beautiful. I find that actually miraculous. And, that in itself is that's the testament, right? Right. That is why we get to be religious people. How amazing is God that we get to do that, that we are able to do that. So it's a shame to forget all of that history.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next misunderstanding or misconception is that all Jews believe in God and all Jews are religious.
Okay. Interesting. So two separate things. So I recently read an article in the New York Times about how Americans are becoming de-churched. And it was a very funny article for one particular reason. They highlighted that Jews and Buddhists are the most de-churched American religious groups, which was hilarious to me because I was unaware that either of us were churched. And also, I know that many, many Buddhists live far from a place with a teacher and may not belong to groups that have regular weekly meetings in the first place. That is not necessarily a part of Buddhist practice.
Right.
It has been true for a very, very long time that most American Jews do not attend synagogue on a regular basis. And that doesn't mean that they don't think of themselves as religious. And it doesn't mean that I wouldn't call them religious, because that is one aspect of being engaged in Jewish life and Jewish peoplehood. And it's one of many, right? So the folks in our community who don't attend services every week or even, once a month, who are the heads of our Tikkun Olam, our Repairing the World committees, or who are, working on membership and in-reach and making sure people get fed when their family member goes into the hospital or when they have a new baby, right? Those people are religious, right? Those people are building religious community and they are engaging in the work, right? So I would not call those folks non-religious. That being said, roughly half of American Jews don't belong to synagogues. And historically, what Jews belong to was not necessarily synagogues. I mean, lots of folks belong to synagogues, but they belong to many, many other Jewish community organizations, many of which were set up as welfare organizations for new immigrants, for new Jewish immigrants. And that was where they had a lot of their Jewish engagement. Many of those organizations either no longer exist or exist in much, much smaller ways. And so there's sort of a hole in that way among, the life of American Jews, fewer places to engage that aren't explicitly synagogues, which is hard for people who don't want to engage in the worship piece as much, right? Figuring out where to belong in Jewish community without those places. So that's like a struggle, I think, for a lot of American Jews, is figuring out where to be, if not in a synagogue, but still in Jewish community. I would also say there are a lot of Jewish atheists and agnostics. That is very, very, very common in all movements, and it's not a problem. It's I for my own part, I have a very deep faith, and which even that language I've definitely borrowed from Christian colleagues. It's never how I would have talked about my own Judaism before I was in deep relationship with Christians, but I have a little envy about their ability to talk in that way. So I have a very deep faith, and I really want to support other Jews who want to engage in wrestling with God and their own God beliefs on their own terms. And I do that with lots of members, and I do have lots of community members in our own congregation who feel very, very faithful in that way. And so there is diversity, right? There is diversity among God belief, but there's no litmus test, right? So when you join a synagogue, nobody asks you if you believe in God. If you join an Orthodox synagogue, they probably will want to know on some level, do you keep kosher at home? Do you keep Shabbat in the way that our community expects you to, right? There are certain norms of community and of community practice, less so in liberal movements, but still, it's not completely normless. But nobody's going to ask you in any of those movements if you believe in God. It's just not going to be a question. Nobody has to make any faith statements. And there is no dogma really around what faith statements are acceptable and not acceptable.
I love that. And it also...
same, resonating so much.
It makes me feel so grateful for the congregation that I'm a part of, especially given how I identify with term in relationship to beliefs and dogma. So, if you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you're probably aware that that I'm pretty agnostic. On some days I'm pretty agnostically atheist, and on other days I'm pretty agnostically theist, but I still identify very strongly as Christian. And the congregation that I'm a part of, it's a Christian church that has never once asked me what I believe about God.
It's totally a new thing. Nate and I are on our own journey. We're in a similar spot. I think I would agree with you in terms of how I feel it probably lean more atheistic, some probably overall than theistic, but it's been a weird journey. I think I grew up my whole life being very believing in the deity and like that relationship, which was drilled into my head. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. These are evangelical. This is evangelical lingo. Yeah. But it shifted in me as a lot of things sort of fell apart, and as I started noticing more and more issues with the whole thing. And I never imagined I would land back in a church, let alone be in a church where they weren't trying to litmus test if I believed in God, and where being agnostic was comfortable in a church. I would have assumed that would have been impossible in a Christian church. So hearing that's normative, that's not a problem in Judaism, that that as a whole it's sort of acceptable to, like there's not a push for you have to believe, it's lovely. Like I feel like I found some small segment of Christianity that does that, but it makes me excited to know that in Judaism that's more common of a thing.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth from Woodbridge, New Jersey, and I listen to Full Mutuality while cooking dinner.
Are you an alumnus of an evangelical college or university? Or have you ever wondered what attending or working at one of those schools is like? The Chapel Probation Podcast brings you the stories from students, faculty, and administration who experienced all the racism, the queerphobia, the misogyny, and purity culture weirdness that are kind of the hallmarks of these schools. I'm Scott Okamoto, author of Asian American Apostate, Losing Religion and Finding Myself at an Evangelical University, which tells my story of teaching English at an evangelical school and realizing I didn't believe in God or the Bible anymore. I created Chapel Probation as a complement to my book, but this podcast has become its own community of people who have stories of hurt and pain and stories of triumph during and after their time at evangelical schools. Some of the guests you've probably heard of, but most of them you probably haven't. But all the stories are incredible examples of surviving Christian schools and finding ourselves. You can find Chapel Probation wherever you listen to podcasts, and I hope you'll join us.
You'll often hear people talking about two different sort of rubrics about how you talk about both behavior in Judaism and belief in Judaism. So some folks will say, the first thing that happens is belonging, a sense of belonging, and then behaving as a Jew, and then believing, right? That might be the end, right? But the expectation is that you should have a sense of belonging first, and you should have behavior, right? Jewish behavior, which looks various ways depending on your community. And that's going to lead to belief. And that rubric is often based on a midrash, which is a sort of expanded story around sacred text. Midrash about receiving the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. So in Torah, it says that the Jews were standing, or the Israelites were standing at the base of Mount Sinai, right? And it was said, will you accept these commandments? And they said, we will do, and we will hear, or we will obey, right? And so the sense is like, we're going to do the thing, and that's what's going to lead us into behavior or into belief. And there's a midrash about this text that is basically like the Jews accepted it because they were standing at the bottom of the mountain, and what that means is really that God lifted up the mountain and they were underneath it, about to get crushed. which I find hilarious, like a very funny rabbi joke. This is like an ancient midrash, right?
Wow.
Like 2,000 years ago, the rabbis are like joking. Would we have accepted this if we were not standing under the mountain? But we did stand under the mountain. We belong, right? We were part of this group standing under the mountain. We belonged. And then we said, we will behave. We will do, right? And that's what's going to lead us into belief. And that is how Jewish communities are structured, right? There's a sense of, are you part of the community, right? Are you one of these folks who's going to cook a meal for someone, who's going to show up to a Shiva house, who's going to receive care from the community, right? Are you going to do those things, be part of the community? Will you feel a part? Will you behave, whether that means, following mitzvot in a particular traditional way or a non-traditional way, whether that means doing social justice, whether that means doing other kinds of care for the wider community. And then belief is something that really flows out of our behavior, right? It doesn't go the other way for many of us. And that resonates for me because I grew up as an agnostic or atheist. I came home, the story my mother tells, said I came home from kindergarten. I went to a Jewish day school, San Diego Jewish Academy. And I said, you will not believe what they told me. And there's like this character named God, and it's ridiculous. I had this whole thing, and I was really firm in my doubt until 16 or 17 years old. And that never kept me from being really committed to synagogue. That actually never kept me from being able to pray. Because I understood prayer as being something that lifted up the whole community, that was about belonging and behaving, that it wasn't about my personal belief, but it was about sitting there in community and being able to sing the same words as my ancestors and, to be able to do that with all of these generations of folks sitting in the same room, loving each other. Like that was very, very powerful for me before I believed.
You're getting me choked up because like some of the things you're putting words on, I've never heard anyone put into words, but they're the things that I appreciate about my current community. And I still participate in prayer, whereas I used to have a belief where I spoke to a divine being that I believed in. Now I still sit in prayer, and there's still something so precious to me about it. And it's hard to explain what that's like without saying, oh, I'm talking to a divine being. 'Cause that sounds like the ultimate, at least from where I had come from. But to hear you express the beauty of prayer in a different way of what that meant to you when you were a kid and when you didn't have that. And it just touches me. You've really put language to things that my heart was feeling, but I couldn't. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the third one that I want to touch on, and maybe just briefly because the fourth one is the one that'll lead us into the further conversation. But the third one is, and again, like this all to me sounds like monolithic statements, and it's similar to like I bristle against it because it's similar to when you hear monolithic statements about Asians, all Asians like spicy food, or all Asians drive poorly, those kinds of things. So this is, when I read these misconceptions, I feel a little bit of that same sort of bristling. But here's another monolithic kind of statement. All Jews support the state of Israel.
I'm going to do this briefly. Come on. Come on. Okay. So I want to say
worms.
I want to say a couple things. So first, support. What does support mean? I would say the vast majority of Jews would consider themselves in some way or another connected to Israel, the state of Israel, and that many of us are connected to the state of Israel, both because half of the Jews in the world live there, which means our family members live there, our dear friends live there, and partly because Israel provides a incredibly important safety net for world Jewry, and it is very difficult to forget that fact. Even though many of us, there was a time in my life when I felt like if I need to leave the United States, I will go make Aliyah. I'll move to Israel. And at this point in my life, I don't think that I would do that. There are other places I might go first. But but it still provides that place of refuge that it was originally intended to provide. And so most Jews support Israel in those ways, in very real ways. I would also say that most American Jews in particular have deep divisions over the behavior of the government of the state of Israel, and have a lot of are having a lot of crisis around that, and where we might not have been having that level of crisis 30 years ago, as we are now.
Right.
And I would say that is true in a variety of ways for a lot of people, even people who are still feeling very strongly like, Israel is so important to us as a Jewish people that, we can't possibly understand what they're dealing with and the decisions they have to make. And so we have to be supportive, publicly and privately, because this is so crucial, right? And a lot of Jews who don't feel that way, who feel like a lot of angst around that. And I'd also say, I just want to go a little bit further about that, which is that the way that Christianity supports Israel often looks very different from the way the Jews support Israel. So for Christians, there's theological issues involved. For most Jews, theology is not really an issue in our support for Israel. We don't support Israel because we think God gave us Israel, right? That's not the issue, or because we're trying to lay the ground for the Messiah to come. In fact, in the early waves of immigration from Eastern Europe to then Palestine, there was a lot of pushback among Orthodox Jews because they said, we can't build a state of Israel. You can't have that. You can't have it until we have a kingdom of Israel heralded in by the Messiah, right? And it would be, like spitting at God to do this. It would be heresy to do this, right? There are actually lots of Orthodox Jews who live in Israel now who still feel that way, right?
Wow.
Who are very opposed to the state of Israel on theological grounds, even though they want to live in the land of Israel for theological reasons, for religious reasons. So it's very complex. And I would say that support for the project of building the state of Israel actually came very slowly in the American context, because American Jews, as opposed to European Jews at the same time, were pretty comfortable. And, this wasn't our issue. We didn't want to find some place to run away to. And we were not being murdered in the street. So, there's very different pushes and pulls there. But support is very complicated. It's very complicated. And I love Israel. I love the state of Israel. I am very distressed by the state of Israel. I am very distressed for the plight of Palestinians, both, for historic reasons and today. And, and also next week I'm traveling there, and I'm going to be living in Jerusalem for 3 weeks and studying in Jerusalem. And that's very complicated. I haven't been there in a long time. I know the landscape is going to be very different. And I have complicated feelings about doing that at this moment in time. And at the same time, I love and appreciate the state of Israel. And I'll say just a little bit more. I mean, I could talk about this for the rest of the night, but one thing that really struck me when I was first there, I traveled to Israel for the first time when I was 19, was the sense of being a majority for the first time in my life, and how weird and amazing that felt. And it was, it was like otherworldly. And I was really smitten by that. And I think I'm over it now. It's fine. I can be a religious minority in the United States. There are a lot of freedoms that living in the United States affords me. In fact, religiously, that living in Israel would not afford me. But it was a shocking kind of thing. And, and I think a lot of folks resonate with that feeling, that sense of wow, there's a place. And I think for the state of Israel, it is a very complicated thing to figure out, what does it look like to be in power? For, the first time in 2 millennia. Like, what does it look like to be powerful, to command one of the most powerful armies in the region? What does it look like to wield this level of power over other people and over each other, and how to do that? How to do that in a way that is appropriate to be in the League of Nations, what does that look like?
Wow.
It is a very complex thing to untangle. And I would say the misconception all Jews support the state of Israel is not really a misconception. The misconception is like, what does support mean?
Yes. Yes.
Right? And why? And what does it look like in practice? And, and it's like, it's a lot more complicated. It's just a lot more complicated than one would assume.
Is there like dinner table debates around this in Jewish families for like discussing the politics in Israel, or do these conversations
these conversations are happening. I think they aren't always easy conversations. There's a lot of intergenerational trauma in the Jewish community, and a sense of sometimes critique does not feel as comfortable in some spaces as others. But I think it's a place where people are really trying to grow and and figure out, like, how can we have these conversations and know that we still have this love, right? For both our people who are there, right? And for the miracle that the state exists in the history of Jewish communities, right? Like, it's a miracle in Jewish history. Like, how can we not be, not feel like it's a problem to critique, right? In the same way that, like, I'm an American and I critique my government all day long. And it's really understandable among other Americans that you can be a proud American and still have critique for the government, right? And for the state. And even for, like, the fact of states and borders and nations in the first place, right? You can have critique for all of that and still be a proud American. And that's true of Israelis too, right? That Israelis also have that same level or worse of critique for their own state. And that American Jews or other diaspora Jews who are not Israeli citizens, right? I don't have a vote over there, right? Have a level of critique as well, but also this from a distance, right? And also this historic love and commitment. And that this is a much more complicated issue for Jews to talk about than it might be for Christians.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica from the Leaving the Village podcast. I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for tuning into this show. We're so grateful that you've decided to spend your time with us. Seriously, Dan, Gail, Kathleen, Nate, Scott, and the rest of us here at the Dauntless Media Collective couldn't produce content like the show you're listening to without your support. I'd also like to invite you even further into the conversation. Right now, there are some great discussions happening over in the Dauntless Media Collective Discord server. If you're interested in chatting with other folks who are deconstructing and decolonizing the oppressive traditions they came from, please feel free to hop onto the server. If you don't know what Discord is, it's a place where communities can gather online for chatting on a wide variety of topics. In our Discord server, we have channels devoted to general deconstruction conversations, some meme sharing, therapeutic venting about whatever religious bullshit you're currently dealing with, and even a channel specifically devoted to talking about the latest episode of the podcast you're listening to right now. I hope you'll join us. You can log in directly to the Dauntless server by clicking on the link in the show notes or heading to dauntless.fm and clicking on the link in the top banner. See you there.
I do want to quickly touch on something that resonated with me as you were talking about that sense of, walking into a space and in a nation state and you're the majority. There is something I like, even from my own experience of whenever I go to visit Japan, and I didn't notice it so much when I was a little kid, but I think the first time I really sort of recognized it was in 2017, which was one of the more recent times that I went back, walking around and not feeling like there was an expectation on me about something, right? There was a stereotype that was going to be leveled towards me. And I mean, there was a whole lot of other baggage about walking around in a country where I didn't speak the language, but to feel that sense of, oh, okay, I can feel comfortable in my own skin and feel safe from those microaggressions. That was something. So your description of that really, I mean, it sent chills down the good kinds of chills. So thank you for sharing that. That was powerful. Okay, so the last misunderstanding that'll kind of move us into the other part of this conversation. Going to a Seder represents Jesus's Last Supper.
Okay, so remember that thing I said about Rabbinic Judaism?
Mm-hmm.
The Seder is an invention of Rabbinic Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably an invention of Rabbinic Judaism that comes after the split of early Christianity off of Jewish community, right? So if there was some community between the early Jewish Christians, first century Jewish Christians, and the rest of the Jewish community, the Seder comes after that split. So Jesus didn't celebrate a Seder, but as a first century Jew, Jesus likely went and made sacrifices in the temple, as similar to how it's described in the Torah, and as the rest of the Jewish community would do as well, and ate it with, ate that lamb with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. These are all biblical elements of the Passover sacrifice, and had a meal, right? Because that's what you do when you go and sacrifice something, is you have a feast. And drink wine, because that's what Jews drink. So yes, for sure. If Jesus had a meal during Passover in his life, it looked like that. And probably had many of them every year of his life. And, but the Seder is something in particular, right, that comes after the death of Jesus and after that split, after the destruction of the Second Temple.
Mm-hmm.
And the Seder is a long retelling of the Exodus from Egypt. It is it's sort of the height of rabbinic culture, because the goal of the evening is to expand and expand and expand upon the story for as many hours as you possibly can. And to do that technique that I mentioned before, midrash, where you're expanding on the story, you're stretching the story out, and adding elements to it from your imagination and from tradition. And that's what the Seder is. So it has many, many elements. Those elements, many of them are probably borrowed from the tradition of Greek symposia, from this tradition of having an elaborate formal meal, which doesn't appear anywhere else in Jewish tradition of that time. There are later sort of other Seders that get invented, but at that time, that seems to be built on this Greek formal meal, including there's a tradition to lean on a pillow and recline. That's probably borrowed from Greek tradition. So that is later. That comes later. And there's no Messianic element in Jewish Seders of any sort. And I should just add as an aside, in Jewish thought, if you're thinking about a Messiah, which most Jews aren't thinking about a Messiah ever, but if you're thinking about a Messiah, that is a human being, not a god, because it's considered incredibly heretical to say that God would come in a human form. That's beyond the pale. That's not how God works. God is not embodied. So there's no messianism in the Seder. It doesn't point toward anything, right? And the history that it remembers is our mythic history of the Exodus from Egypt. And many people will today, just like everything else, the Seder evolves, right? So today, the Seder is often used as an opportunity to talk about other Exodus moments in history, right? To talk about Exodus movements, to talk about social justice issues, to talk about modern day slavery and how it exists around the world still, right? And how we should be engaged in fighting that. So the Seder does evolve in many places, but it doesn't talk about Jesus. And Jesus wasn't at one.
So that brings us to the conversation that I think we want to really have, because it's sort of a point of contention for in the evangelical world and the post-evangelical world and our relationship with Judaism. and that is this idea of Messianic Jews, or the Jews for Jesus movement, as it were, and whether that's in any way, shape, or form related to Judaism. I think the question then, from your perspective, what is a Messianic Jew? What are the Jews for Jesus?
Can I just quickly interject? I wanted to say, like, as an evangelical in the past, it was the only form of Judaism that was sort of presented to me as Judaism, and we idolized. Like, these were like, and it's sad, like right now it makes me feel bad to think of it, but it was like, these were like the remnant of real Jews that got it right. And so there was sort of like this reverence for people that were in that movement, and lifting up of their voices, prioritizing their opinions on things. But it kind of went in contrast to other Jews, which is the majority of the Jewish movement. So but like that was the perspective that we were given, and like there was just this awe of it from evangelicals over anyone who said they were a Messianic Jew, and like this willingness to listen to them specifically, because they were, I think they were, maybe this, I'd love to hear your take on this, but I feel like they were just sort of confirming, like, we came out of the Jewish movement, and we are like the improvement on it and the culmination of what God was trying to do. And so they kind of just drove that message home. I don't know if that's making any sense, but I'd like to hear your take.
I got a lot to say about this. Jews hate it when Christianity is presented as like Judaism 2.0. That is so...
I don't blame you.
Such a problem for so many reasons, right? So, I mean, like in general, this sense that Christianity answers a problem and Judaism provides a solution for a problem in Judaism is so bizarre to Jews, because that problem doesn't exist in Judaism, right? So the idea that like we can't possibly do enough to overcome our sinful nature and properly follow all of God's laws, and so we're just like irredeemable by our own merit, is not an idea that exists in Judaism. Of course we can't be perfect. That's fine. Like, God made us and knows we're not perfect. That's not a problem. Not a problem, right? We are not suffering under that. We're not worried about being saved or redeemed or anything else. That is not a thing we're trying to achieve in the first place, right? So this entire idea is so perplexing to Jews, because it just it answers a problem that doesn't exist, and or a question that doesn't exist, right? We weren't asking the question, why do you keep giving us an answer? So that's like one thing that is just so odd, right? The other piece is that Messianic Judaism or Jews for Jesus, both of which are Christian movements and not Jewish in any way. Just to be clear, they're both Christian movements comprised of Christians entirely, and are not Jewish and are not part of Judaism. And I feel free to speak for all of Judaism on that question. I would not generally say, what I said is true for all Jews, but I will say that that's true for all Jews. They're not Jews. So, but they appeal to that same desire we were talking about before, about like hearkening back to some mythological past, some perfected past where we like did it right, where we understood, where we got the message firsthand, where we, whatever it was, and we knew how to do it, right? This bizarre anti-historical way of trying to live. And they really like scratch that itch for people who are looking for that kind of thing, right? They're like, oh, if Jews just listened, it would look like this. So the way that both of those movements organize themselves is they kind of like look at modern Jews, right? And of course, again, modern Jews are practicing rabbinic Judaism, right? They're practicing a Judaism that has evolved since the time of the temple, since the time of Tanakh, and since the time of Jesus, because 2,000 years have passed, right? So they look at Jews today and they say, I'll take this, I'll take this, I'll take this, I'll take this, right? This kind of looks Jewish, and then I'll do Christianity, wearing those clothes, right? And of course, Jews who believed in Jesus in one way or another in the first century, right? They evolved and they look like Christians today, they just look like Christians today. They don't look like current Jews slapping some Jewish practices or some Jewish garb on Christianity, right? Like that's just not what it would look like, right? It doesn't make any sense in that way. The other piece that's really important to notice is that Messianic Jews and Jews for Jesus give Christianity kind of a cover. I think most Christians actually get that they're not Jews, right? So this is, I mean, I don't know if most, but like, I think many movements don't get that they're not Jews.
Yeah. I think most non-evangelical Christians will recognize that those are not Jewish traditions in any way, shape, or form. I think in evangelical circles, they might have an easier time pulling the wool over people's eyes.
Yeah.
Because it answers that longing in the evangelical heart. It's one of those things that just addresses a big concern that evangelicals have. And so they sort of, they take that one in hook, line, and sinker.
I think in evangelical, I agree with you, Nate. And I think an important note in evangelical culture is this whole rapture end times belief system with Jesus coming back. And like, there's like a mythology that sort of evolved, taking pieces of the New Testament and pretending like we had some way of looking at all. Like it's very new beliefs that like, this idea of a rapture, this idea that Revelations was saying this, or this, whereas that's not how it was written originally. Like to the people that were reading it then, it was a different, completely different way of looking at it. But so these new teachings have sort of come about in such a way that certain things need to be set up a certain way in Israel. Like Israel's a part of the end and what's going to happen. So therefore, there's that fascination with the Jewish people and like, but it's channeled through the Messianic Jewish group because they're able to reflect the belief systems. So they are, I feel like Messianic Jews are pretty evangelical in terms of even maybe their Christian positions on stuff as well.
Yes, I think that's true. But it provides some cover, right? Because there's like, oh, Jews agree with us, right? And it's very funny to see President Trump with a Jewish rabbi.
Just for those who can't see, Rabbi Ariann is doing air quotes around.
Blessing him in Jesus' name, right? So this is like not a thing. That's not a thing. Jews don't do that. Right? Not a thing. And so both of those movements also, in large part, exist to missionize Jews, right? To evangelize to Jews. And they both have significant presence in the state of Israel, in fact. And produce all kinds of things in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, in order to like appeal to Israeli Jews, which is a very interesting thing to attempt. And they are very, very interested. If you meet them on the street, the Jews for Jesus used to be out pre-COVID everywhere, all the time. I don't know if they're back, but they were really interested in talking to Jews, right? Because their goal is to move Jews into Christianity. And it is, it's a problem, right? It's really a problem. There are organizations like Jews for Judaism, right, which exist specifically to speak, especially to young people, right? Because a lot of this happens on college campuses and in those kinds of spaces where people don't have a lot of support. To reach out to those people and say, like, here's why this is not a thing, right?
Yeah.
Here's why this is not Judaism. And I can speak as a former Jewish college student. Evangelical groups on campus are very persuasive and very engaging to non-Christians and to non-evangelical Christians trying to sort of like, embrace them. So for a few years in college, I was engaged with a group called InterVarsity.
I'm very familiar. I am familiar with IVCF. Yeah. Yeah.
So they were really interesting. Some dear friends of mine were involved, and they invited me to a meeting to teach something about Judaism. And I was like, oh, this is interfaith dialogue. I'm so down, And
oh boy.
Really boy. I did it. People were lovely. And I did it. It was strange, but I did it. And then they prayed over me, and that was weird. And then I joined one of their small group Bible studies in my dorm. And, it was not a compelling thing. It was not a compelling argument for Christianity. We read a lot of parables, and I was like, this is dumb. Like the way, not the text itself, but like the way that they were engaging with it was very childish. And it was clear they were like reading a script, right? So it was like, oh, this is not serious. You guys are a lot smarter. You're like engineering students. What is this? But also they were so caring toward me, right? They were really, really working hard to recruit me. In a variety of ways, right? There was like this very serious love bombing going on all the time. And they were friends, right? And I was really engaged with them in that way. And when I left college and I, like a couple years out, I'm applying to rabbinical school. I had a friend who was part of this group, and she sent me in the mail a tract, like a Christian tract.
Oh, yeah.
With her Christmas card that year. And I called her and I said, I'm so hurt by this. Like, why would you send this to me? I'm applying to rabbinical school. Like, you know how like committed I am to this thing that I'm doing. She said, I love your Judaism. I love your Judaism. I just want you to complete it. I just want you to accept Jesus. I just want you to, I'm worried about your soul, like that, this kind of stuff. And we haven't talked since, of course, but it was just, I found it was shocking. It was shocking to me. And because I didn't get it. I just didn't get what the goal was. It was so foreign to me. But this is what Jews for Jesus is about. Like, this is part of the same movement, and the same desire to specifically evangelize to Jews. And it's like hard. It's a little hard for me to wrap my mind around as a Jew, because this is not a thing that Jews do, right? Like, we're worried about everyone's soul, but in a human way, right? Not in a, we need you to be Jewish kind of way, right? In fact, don't be Jewish. It's hard. Like, you don't have to be.
There's no Jewish movement trying to recruit other people into becoming Jewish. That's not a thing.
As soon as that happens, that's not Judaism, right? That's a big clue. That's not Judaism, because we don't need you to do that. We think you can be great exactly as you are. It's unnecessary. If you want to join us, great, we'll have you.
Yeah.
There's a process. We'll have you, but we don't need you to do that, right? And we can love you as you are, and actually love you, right, as you are.
Yeah.
So this is it's all part of the same shtick. And just, a warning to people trying to buy Jewish garb on Amazon. Don't do that. If you want to buy Jewish things like a talit, buy it from a proper Judaica store, because a lot of that stuff is Messianic stuff. And you should just watch out. Buyer beware.
Yeah.
It's a true reflection of, my experience within evangelicalism as well. Like I said, it's an evangelical movement, Messianic Judaism, and the love bombing thing that you mentioned is not just to Jewish people, it is to anyone that's vulnerable to get you in. And it's very different. Like, it is a save your soul mentality, and you're going to go to hell if you don't receive this message. So you have to believe what we believe, and it's the most dire thing out there. Yeah. And so everything else sort of just falls. That becomes just the driving force, and all the other stuff just gets justified in the name of trying to meet that one thing. So when you were describing that whole situation on what it's like to be love bombed, I remember being a part of love bombing and not having words for what I was doing, having that agenda when meeting with people. I was on that side of things where I was trained to do that. I was indoctrinated from childhood to meet people and to try and recruit as a part of, and in my mind, recruit, save them from hell was the most, could I be more loving? You know what I mean? Like, if there's some eternal battle and I'm snatching their souls from hellfire, it's fascinating to me to have these conversations, even in terms of like when you talked about the Seder and you talked about the mythical history of Judaism. Like, we were taught as evangelicals that it was historical, and it isn't until recently that I ever learned that Jews do not. And it makes so much more sense now, because I was like going through it in my mind, and we were told it was history, and it's sort of like Noah's Ark. It's just things that are not adding up at all. And like the evangelicals are like, these are historical facts. And like, it took me a long time in listening to some Jewish teachings to go, no, Jews, a lot of Jews, most Jews, I'm not sure on this one. It would be a question to you. But I had first heard that idea that it was a mythological history, the Exodus story, from Jewish people, and that was shocking to me because I had never known that in my own learning.
And for sure, there's diversity on that question, but I would say that, and I'm speaking as like a grown-up who's a professional Jew, who's well educated, who's done all the biblical criticism, whatever. What I would say about the way that Jews understand Torah in general is that we kind of hold things lightly, and we hold them lightly so that they can be many things at once, right? So it's totally possible for a Jew who really believes that the Exodus happened very literally as described, which there's plenty of Jews who believe that, right? They can hold that, and they can also hold other things. They can hold, for example, all the Midrashim, all these extra stories, which are contradictory, right? At the same time, and being able to hold all of that together is considered praiseworthy, right? That you can hold so much, you can have so much Torah at once, is a really cool thing. And so, even though there are plenty of Jews who believe in the literal Exodus, far fewer who believe in the literal creation. That is very, very unpopular among the Jewish world, although there are some, but it's not a popular idea in any way. We don't have creationism in the same way as we never have. But but you can hold all of those things and sort of like where the line of mythic history versus factual history versus something else versus poetry, right? A lot of this stuff that we point to and it's like, that's fact. It's a poem. It's poetry.
Right.
Right? It's a parable. It's it's something else entirely. Being able to hold that lightly allows for this multiplication of interpretation, which is how we survive with this text. It's how we keep drawing out meaning from the text. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay. Right. And I am, as a person who believes that the Exodus is mythic history versus like a thing that actually happened, I can be as deeply invested in the Seder, in the Passover story, in all of that practice as someone who believes that it factually happened, right? Because it is a deep religious theological truth, this story, right? Even if it didn't happen in real life, right? That is what it means to be like a grown-up religious person, is being able to do that. And and I'm so appreciative, Gail, of you sharing all of that about your own story. And it totally makes sense to me that like if you think people are going to hell, that's an emergency that you have to solve, right? That makes a lot of sense. And and it's an interesting conflict for me now to have compassion for people who are
evangelizing to Jews.
No, because it's like they're coming from somewhere that is so different from where I'm coming from. But they really believe that they're doing something essential and holy work, and that they're doing something good for me, right? And I appreciate it. I appreciate that intention, even though at the same time it feels like such an enormous violation.
Right.
And that's like a hard thing to hold both of those things at once.
Yeah.
But it's something I'm trying to practice.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that if there are any evangelicals that listen to us, and I have high doubts on that, it's probably the ones that are starting to question things where the cracks are starting. But I'd hope that if they still had that perspective or take that they're saving people from hell, that they would at least consider and think hard about the way it feels coming from the other from the other side. Like, you're trying to take the time to understand where they're coming from. I would want them to understand the offense and the harm and the hurt that could be done to Jewish people by taking this approach. It's not something that I would have considered in my evangelical days, but the concepts that drove me forward and drove me out of evangelicalism was this belief that love and was the most important thing, and how to love your neighbor as yourself, and that being the core was something to me that made me. I had to ask these questions. What does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? What would I want someone to do to others as you would have them do to you? These sort of teachings in Christianity that kind of helped direct me to question some of the other teachings that I was taught. And in that line of even saving people from hell, I did want to ask you. Was really curious to ask a rabbi. The teaching of hell, is that something? I had heard different things. So as a Christian, I've been taught hell exists, especially as an evangelical, that's super core. In Jewish teachings, is hell a thing? Is that something, we're not trying to save people, so I'm guessing maybe not. Like, it's just...
Okay, the afterlife is another thing that Jews hold very lightly. Because there are a multiplicity of ideas, and none of them matter because God will figure it out and it's all good. But...
I like that.
We really, really don't talk about the afterlife in general. We sometimes conflate two ideas, olam haba, which means the world to come, which could mean both an afterlife, like an afterlife for the spirit, and it also could mean the world sort of reborn post-Messianic age, right? The literal resurrection of bodies and all of that stuff, right? Which is a historic Jewish understanding of the time of the Messiah. So, both of those things are called olam haba, which is a little confusing, right? Many people teach that there's sort of a purification period for people's souls after they die, and that the worst possible, person might be purified for 12 months, and then you all move on. And so there's this custom of saying the mourner's Kaddish, which is a prayer that's not actually about death. It's just sort of a generic prayer, but mourners in particular, will say it as part of the service.
Okay.
And that you don't say the mourner's Kaddish for more than 11 months, because if you say it for 12 months, you're saying my beloved's soul needed to be prayed for 12 months as they undergo this purification, and that nobody's that bad,
Okay.
They're the worst possible human.
Hilarious sort of, thing about that. Little superstition about that. But even that is sort of a very lightly held belief. It's not really a thing that I believe happens. I don't think that it's a thing that many people believe happens. But again, we hold it very lightly. You don't have to be Jewish to get an afterlife. That's, if that afterlife exists, right? And there's no expectation that people should be Jews. Jews are we are an ethnic group, and it's cool. We can just keep on doing our thing. We approach God our way, right? We have this particular relationship. Other people are allowed to have different relationships with God.
That's pretty cool.
And sort of none of that really impacts your soul post death. Even
so
this
eternal, the eternal conscious torment thing. It's not a thing. Not a thing.
Not a thing at all. It's not a thing at all.
And for anyone who's this is something that for me, it was one of the major things that started pushing me away from evangelical Christianity, was an exploration of that idea of the afterlife and hell, and the words that got translated into English from the ancient Hebrew and the Greek in the Christian New Testament, and those words that got turned into hell in English that don't have any of those kinds of connotations in Koine Greek or ancient Hebrew. They're either things like the grave, simply put, just your burial site, or Jesus talked about Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom, and he was making a reference to a certain story in the book of Isaiah. It was a very specific geographical location. He wasn't talking about an afterlife. And then there's also the Greek word Hades, which, again, it's the Greek mythology that we then I started tracing that word and its etymology, and then the word hell and how that got pulled in from Norse mythology and the realm known as Helheim, and how that then found its way into English translations of the Bible. And none of that paints this picture that we end up getting from Dante's Inferno. So it's almost as if the entirety of evangelicals' conception of the afterlife and their foundational belief system is all based on Dante Alighieri's book.
It's
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, I think that particularly around the time of the writing of the New Testament, there's a lot of more florid ideas about the afterlife in Jewish circles as well. And they haven't persisted in the same way in the Jewish world. Like it was in the air. Like a lot of this stuff was in the air. But it has not become part of like sort of normative Jewish conversations that persist through time. So it's sort of an interesting thing. Like in Tanakh, there's no afterlife. There's the grave. Right. And you go to sleep with your ancestors, right? Like it just doesn't exist. Resurrection exists, right? That's a thing that happens a couple times in Tanakh. As sort of like a miraculous one-off, and like maybe a thing that might happen again. Who knows? And that was really grabbed onto by Jewish thinkers about like what would it look like in the future in this olam haba, in this world to come. Like that would be amazing, right? So there's a lot of practices around like folks will in some communities will put a little bit of dirt from the land of Israel into their graves if they're buried elsewhere, as part of this like connection to this story about in the resurrection of the dead, like it'll start in the land of Israel and spread out. So if you are buried with some of the land of Israel, it might start with you. But I think this is one of these rituals that's sort of, again, held a little lightly. Yeah. It's like there's a lot of rituals around death that are sort of in that spirit. But just sort of like a hopeful, beautiful connection rather than a conscious belief in the part of the mourners.
So before we wrap up, I did want to ask you, I think there was something that you had mentioned before we hit record, specifically regarding how anti-Semitism manifests, and I don't remember exactly what you had mentioned. We were
talking about how sometimes when we leave Christian spaces, Christians,
yes, that's right.
We can deconstruct a lot of different things. Sometimes we take certain things that are unhealthy with us even as we leave. So this idea that harmful teachings that we might be taught in Christianity, white supremacy is one of them. Christian nationalism. There's a lot of things that get baked into sometimes our Christian beliefs, and as we deconstruct, we've got to pull apart a lot of pieces and not just ignore it and just close the door. And you brought up how anti-Semitism is one of those things that gets baked in, and sometimes can carry its way outside. So I'd love to hear you elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
People wanting to.
So some of the things that I might have brought up in that arena didn't come up in our conversation, but I want to just like point out very briefly that anti-Judaism begins in Christianity historically, and is around the attitudes towards Jews after the death of Jesus and after the crystallization of the early Christian church and its separation from Judaism. And a lot of those attitudes persist in Christianity. A lot of them have evolved and persist in, white supremacy and Christian nationalism, like have really taken up these things and are it forms a core of those beliefs. And, it's really easy to take those things as though they are true, right? And leave Christianity and not leave those as well. And I'm appreciative of many churches who are actually doing a lot of work around this. And around, taking texts from the New Testament, for example, that have historically been read in a rather anti-Jewish way, and reframing them either for their historical context or reframing them and pointing out like this was written specifically to be anti-Jewish, right? And here's how we have to unpack that. And that's really incredible, crucial work. A lot of the churches in our area, I know, are doing that kind of work, and it's so appreciated. And I think it's not happening in other churches, right? And so it's something that people have to figure out on their own. I'll like point out a funny example. So, the New Yorker, I used to subscribe to the New Yorker, like a lot of other people who like to own things that they're never going to read. And
I feel like you're calling me out.
And they published a cartoon one year around Christmas that was a few kids who were sitting in the living room, and they're waiting for Santa to come down the chimney, and they're like, "Oh, Santa's coming, and Santa comes down with a whip, and they say, "Oh, it's the Old Testament Santa."
Oh.
And I let go of my subscription after that. But this sense of the Jewish God is an angry and judgmental and, harsh God, whereas the Christian God is very loving and saving and blah, 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 right? Which is not how Jews experience God anyway. Like, this is not a thing. Or the sense that, like, Judaism is legalistic, which I'm not entirely sure what that means, but the sense of, like, Jews just don't get the spirit of being in relationship to God, and they're so legalistic, right? And that's a belief that persists, even if you don't hold the other half of the belief, right? The Christian solution to that supposed problem, right? That Christians are obsessed with, or that Jews are obsessed with money, right? Like, that's why Jesus has to turn the tables, because Jews are robbing, greedy money grabbers, right? Like, like, all of this, right? This is a whole big piece. Even the sense of, like, that Jews are untrustworthy, and because Jews rejected God, right? Right? This like,
right.
It comes from this, like, particularly Christian place of, like, Jews didn't accept Jesus in the way that we wanted them to accept Jesus. And what that means for Jews and their ability to be trusted and their ability to be part of the group, right? Rather than outsiders, and suspect, right? That's the thing that persists. And you can leave aside the Christianity and still persist in those other beliefs. So it's like, it's a thing to unpack. And, it is, and it's not always obvious, right? It's like, some of this is very underneath the surface. But some of it isn't, right? So, I've had folks call me a Pharisee. And it's like, okay, well, that's a compliment. The Pharisees were great.
I'm so glad you brought up this one.
Yes.
They were great. And Jesus argues exactly like a Pharisee in the New Testament. Like, I'm pretty sure he was one. Right? But this, like, yes, Rabbinic Judaism grows out of the Pharisaic movement, right? That was the origins of Rabbinic Judaism. And they're great. And we should be proud of them.
So to any evangelicals listening, or to anyone evangelicals listening, or anyone still having those opinions on Pharisee as an insult,
pejorative,
using
term,
it like pharisaical, meaning, like you said, a pejorative meant as a negative, that is anti-Semitic, and that's important to recognize that is a teaching that comes out of Christianity in an anti-Semitic way towards the Jewish people. It's not how Jews perceive being a Pharisee. Pharisee is an actual group of Judaism that, like you said, Jesus would have came out of himself. So stop doing that. that's one of those. So I'm thankful for the many examples that you gave, because I think sometimes people don't know, okay, well, like, give me something to start with, or some areas, but there's probably many, that people can learn about and start to try and unpack it, that are just baked into a lot of the teaching that Christians hear. So I appreciate you sharing some. If you had more, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut off anything, but
no, it's good. It's good.
It probably comes as like a very strange misnomer or misappropriation when you hear people say things like Judeo-Christian values, because What does that even mean?
And that makes me think, was it you, Nate, quoting Rabbi Ariann to me, talking about, I think he was quoting you to me, saying that you had talked about how Christians often see themselves as like a grandchild of Judaism, like we come out.
No, that was actually Rabbi Mark Katz.
Oh, okay.
Who came in and hung out at an event I was hosting, and he sat down with Reverend Dr. Althea Spencer Miller, and we had this great little conversation. But he mentions, I don't want to bastardize or completely misquote him, but the impression that I got from what he was saying was that there is this kind of misconception amongst Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, but this exists in other streams of Christianity as well. This misconception of Christianity as sort of, I think you had said something along these lines earlier, of Judaism 2.0.
Mm-hmm. That's probably why I was making that connection too.
Yeah. Whereas the Christianity that we see today and the Judaism that we see today are both evolutions of Second Temple Judaism and have grown and evolved from that in their own ways, rather than being, Christianity being the next step or improvement over Judaism. Rather, these two sort of sisters.
That's fair. Yes, that's a fair reading, and I think that the place where it's a very interesting question, like early Christianity and like what was going on there. And when did normative Judaism of the time say, this is not Judaism, the thing that you guys are doing? What was the line? And I think it was at the point where Jesus was God instead of a teacher. But when Christianity became no longer a Jewish movement, right, which happened fairly early, right? It was pretty quick,
yeah.
But still, it was like, it was a generation, or so. But like, that was an interesting move, right? So it's like, in that first century, these are both movements coming out of Second Temple Judaism. And then Christianity becomes a thing that absorbs a whole lot of other people who are not Jewish. And it's not about Judaism anymore. It's about something else, but it's bringing with it the Judaism of that moment, right? And evolving it into something else. So that's a very interesting picture. But yeah, I think, step siblings, something,
yeah.
something like that is a little truer of the moment. And there were other movements that came out of Second Temple Judaism that did not persist, right? So like, here we are. We're left.
Yeah. It's just the two of us left. Yeah.
There are others. I mean, there's actually still Samaritans around, believe it or not. There's some other groups still around. And they're really fascinating, smaller numbers, but
yeah. Gnosticism as well is somewhere in that mix. And there's like, one of my fascinations the last few years were these lost texts that connect to ancient Christianity, but that were deemed not part of the canon of Scripture, and yet hold a lot of weight in how we might perceive the faith. There were arguments about this idea that Jesus actually resurrected. I mean, even if you look at the 4 gospel accounts that we have in our Bible, there seems to be a difference in opinion on whether or not Jesus actually came back to life. And there's I think it's the Gospel of Thomas that alludes to this idea that Jesus was not bodily resurrected, but rather who he was in spirit, and his teachings and ideologies persisted, and the death was so traumatic for his followers that they were perceiving of him after he had died in some kind of spiritual way or hallucinating way. And a lot of the church leaders needed this idea of Jesus bodily resurrecting to persist in order for some legitimacy or something politically. Might have had something to do with relationship to the Roman Empire. And so they shot down this narrative that Jesus was only being perceived in trances or in hallucinations. And it also is kind of telling when you have the character of Thomas showing up as the doubter and being talked about as a doubter, somebody who was doubting Jesus was alive again. And that, this sort of exists within the Christian history and then gets removed from our narrative, which makes me kind of wonder about some of the motives of how, like, at the foundation of our religious system. But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole. But I do connecting your idea, Nate, to something that that Rabbi Ariann said before. When you were talking about Nate mentioning, the resurrection and the debates around it, I was thinking of what you were saying about having an adult faith, and the idea that myth doesn't have to be something inferior. Actually, it can actually be a richer and deeper understanding of something. And I think my Reverend Ann said something at Easter, like, did the resurrection really happen? And then she was like, it's not actually an important question. Yeah. She was like, the question is, how do you apply this into your, like, how does this impact you? Which is, like, I guess coming from my background, was like, I've never heard that before. And it was like understanding how much myths can be rich and beautiful has grown my faith, if I can even say that from an agnostic point of view. It has grown my ability to appreciate and to live out Christianity in a way that's richer. And so when you were talking about that hit me, just that idea of an adult faith. And again, you're putting words on concepts for me that I haven't been able to do, but I appreciate that. It even helps me, the conversations you have about Judaism disagreeing with each other, and this idea of the texts having different opinions from each other. They're not one message. There are many different messages. I think of what Nate was just saying about how these texts, had different opinions, and even the ones that did make canon in the New Testament, the gospel stories of how Jesus came to be, there's like so many disagreements within the text itself. Like, was Jesus crucified on the 3rd hour or before the seat of judgment on the 6th hour? Like, these are both in different gospels, different, like, and I could go through like 10 different things that are just different, but sometimes there's this idea that it's one cohesive message, even in our own Christian text, and it's not actually true if you start to dig into it. And this idea of, I love that what you were talking about holding things loosely. Like when I was asking, okay, what did you think about this or about this? And it's like, kind of hold the things loosely. Like, it's not, we don't have to nail down which is the one, what's the true answer on this. It's like, you can have two ideas. I love that non-binary thinking that you were mentioning about, being able to hold more than one meaning is valuable. Not having to settle on one interpretation is a mature thing to do. It's a beautiful thing to do. It's a rich thing to do, and something I'm trying to expand more towards.
Yeah, it's something that I love about Judaism, and I spoke about sort of the midrashic tradition of expanding the text. There's also part of that tradition is figuring out like what to do with inconsistencies. Right. And putting two texts next to each other that seem to disagree, or even two texts next to each other that are almost identical. Maybe they're off by one word, and figuring out like, how do we both harmonize things while also expanding the text at the same time? Like, how do we do both? And it's an interesting, such an interesting piece of our rabbinic tradition of like trying to figure out how do we make all of these texts make sense as one thing, even though it's a multivocal thing, right? It's such a, like, it's delightful. We get all of that. So, give you an example. There's two, the 10 commandments are repeated in Torah, once in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy. And there are two different versions of the commandment to observe Shabbat in those two texts. So one says to observe, and one says, I'm sorry, like, I can only think in Hebrew. Okay, so one says shamor, which is like observe or protect or guard, and the other one says zachor, which means to remember. And so, there's a couple things you could have done with that, right? So the rabbis could have said, these mean the same thing. These are synonyms, right? And they didn't do that. They said, God would not have repeated it in different ways if it wasn't relevant. They were different. right? So they said, okay, shamor, this guard and observe, this applies to sort of negative commandments around Shabbat. Don't work, right? So guard Shabbat by resting, by not doing something, right? And the other one, zachor, means it's the positive, right? To like bring in Shabbat, on purpose, right? To do something positive to bring it in. And then there's like a whole delineation of what exactly do those things mean, right? But it's like a way of expanding, not just like keep Shabbat, like, it's not just one thing, right? It's like a whole universe of things. And when we do anything, sometimes we're pushing one thing away. Sometimes we're pulling other things in, right? It's like we're doing all those things at once. And so it's important for us to be serious about what does the text actually say and where do they disagree, but not in a way that makes it smaller, right? Always in a way that makes it bigger.
That's beautiful. It's just a beautiful principle for any faith practice. I think even outside of Judaism, the idea of expanding a sacred text in order to widen it and to push you towards growth rather than to make it narrow and settle on one thing. Yeah.
I have loved this conversation, and I'm sure
I feel like we could do this forever, but we do want to respect your time. And it's been such a rich conversation, and I feel like we could ask you so many more things and probably would love to. Which leads me to my question, where can people find you if they want to look up your stuff, if they want to, I don't know if you've put out texts that you've written or things.
I publish very, very little because I have a full-time job. It's not the way I engage with the world. But people can always look me up at B'nai Keshet's website, which is b'naikeshet.org, or email me at rabbiariann@b'naikeshet.org.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to be in touch. Yeah.
And I'll put
welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll put those links in the show notes so people can follow up. And once again, thank you so much for spending this time with us, Rabbi Ariann. This was amazing. I loved this conversation. So
thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast. We're so glad you decided to join us today.
if you haven't already, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Spotify, and pretty much every other podcast app. Just search for Full Mutuality on your app of choice, or visit our website, fullmutuality.com, for links to all of the apps that you can subscribe to us on.
And if you enjoyed what you've heard, we'd love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on our website. A quick review is one of the best ways you can support us.
Speaking of support, you can also partner with us on Patreon. For just $5 US a month, you'll be helping us produce this podcast, and you'll get access to other content such as exclusive episodes, access to occasional live-streamed recording sessions, and more. Just head over to patreon.com/fullmutuality to sign up.
Thanks again for hanging out with us today, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Full Mutuality Podcast.